evening to talk about this great book that I'm still reading. It's pretty interesting, and very excited to talk about Parkchester's history and especially its social history. And let me just make a quick introduction to our presenter tonight, Dr. Jeffrey Gurock. He is a Libby M. Clapperman Professor of Jewish History at the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies of Yeshiva University, an internationally recognized expert in the discipline of American Jewish history, with special interest in the history of American Judaism, the history of New York Jewry, and Judaism in American sports. He is an author or editor of 24 books. His service to the field has included editorships of American Jewish History from 1982 to 2002, and 2 terms as chair of the American Council of the American Jewish Historical Society, amongst many other accolades. Professor Gurock, thank you for being with us, and welcome to our discussion tonight. And thank you. And before I start, I will also like to share a nice little presentation, some loop photographs of Parkchester while we talk about the book, Parkchester, A Bronx Tale of Race and Ethnicity. So let me just start that. Can everyone see that? It's going to be on a loop and it'll be changing, throughout. So Professor Gurock, I've been jumping into your book, and I like it so much because you could just jump into any chapter and it tells its own story. So, I've been in and out of the book, and it's so familiar because I'm from the area. My mom had so many friends at Parkchester. And, as a kid growing up in the 1980s, visiting Parkchester, I noticed the gold mailboxes, the pretty hallways. And I also noticed a very diverse residents, a lot of non-Black, non-Latino. And that was very new for me because I lived in Soundview Projects, just south of Parkchester. So we always had this understanding that Parkchester was a very strict, and we heard about its segregation history and whatnot. But your book actually dives into that. Your book actually studies that. And I've learned that it wasn't just the people that were against Blacks or anyone non-white. It was more of a systematic discrimination. And that was fascinating. And as a Bronx historian, you don't come across stuff like this concentrated in one book. It's mentioned sporadically, about some racial rental policies along the Grand Concourse or in other living communities. But there's no book that I've come across that specifically talks about the racial and social history of a living community here in the Bronx. So thank you so much for putting that, for giving us this piece of knowledge. So I just want to ask, what compelled you? I know you were raised in Parkchester, you're still in the Bronx, you have a huge connection, but a lot of people came from Parkchester, right? A lot of scholars came from Parkchester. What compelled you to study this, to share this information? And why is this so important for us to still know after so many years?
Right, I must tell you, one of the challenges of doing this book is that so many people who I've talked to about the book lived in Parkchester, and their image of what went on when they were growing up, when they were maturing, was different than mine. So one of the things I'm constantly thinking about is whether the truth that I'm teaching is the same as other people. But as far as why I did this book, I happen to be Jewish. And our synagogue is now one of the 6 mosques in Parkchester. And before the synagogue closed, I prevailed upon the last president of the synagogue to let me loot all the records of the synagogue. One of the sad things about Jewish history in New York is very often Jewish communities decline, and with them go all the records. So I got 2 strong kids from my school, and we looted the records, and they're safely ensconced in Yeshiva University's archive. And I decided I'm going to do a book about the neighborhood I grew up in. And I have to tell you, almost all my books emphasize a Jewish story. But this is not really a Jewish story. It's a story of different ethnic groups who get along very well. And as you said correctly, it's also a story of race and the difficulties of racism in New York City. Let me start at the very beginning. Parkchester was a planned community, planned by Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation right before American entry into World War II. It's a large planned community, 171 buildings, 127 acres of previously undeveloped land, which had been a Roman Catholic protectorate until that time. And they built this community. And they were social planners. They wanted to create a community where one of the operative themes that I talk about is the idea was for Jews, Irish, Italians, German Americans, and white Protestants to get along with one another in this new neighborhood. Now, prior to that time, in many areas, Jews and these other ethnic groups did not get along, particularly difficulties with the Irish. But Parkchester was conceived to be, again, a planned community in New York City. It was called a city within a city, and it was designed to bring these groups together. Sadly, from our perspective, until 1968, the neighborhood was totally segregated. There were no Blacks, there were no Latinos in the neighborhood. And you know what? Thinking about my life growing up in Parkchester, and I was born in 1949, and I lived there until we were married in 1974. When I went to the playground and I hung out in the West Quadrant, there were 4 quadrants, it never dawned upon me that there are only white guys in the playground. And when I got on the subway to go into the city, as it was called, you know, if you took the local express from 177th Street, you know that it skipped over the South Bronx. The first stop was Hunts Point. So I was growing up in a neighborhood which was totally segregated. So, excuse me, I'm getting over COVID. A major part of the story is how this neighborhood went from being a segregated neighborhood to being a multi-ethnic, multi-racial neighborhood over the course of time. But it wasn't easy. It was very complicated. And one of the things that I teach my students is, and I want to emphasize this, that when we talk about segregation, very often we talk about legal segregation south of the Mason-Dixon line. The truth of the matter is, New York City was a very segregated city. And until 1968, again, no African Americans or Latinos were allowed in the neighborhood. So one of the chapters is called Blacks and Whites Don't Mix. And that was the term used by Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation to point out how they went about keeping the neighborhood segregated. And Angel, I want to say one other thing preliminarily. In doing this research, I went to the Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation archive. They have an archive in Long Island City, okay? And I'm going through all the records. And I come across the fact that their memos, their instructions on what to do when Mr. Black or Mr. Brown wants to become part of the Parkchester community, okay? And the answer always was, you know what? You're on the list. We're thinking about you being part of the Parkchester community, but nobody gets off the list unless they're white. And that became a centerpiece of one of the chapters, but it's also a story of the Irish and the Jews and the Italians and the Jews who didn't always getting along within the Parkchester neighborhood. So that's just the beginning in terms of the research. I want to say one other thing preliminarily. one of the consciousnesses that dawned upon me as I did this work was to use the term Black is a misnomer. And let me explain what I mean by that, okay? The pigmentation of people of that sort may be Black, but in Parkchester today, you have African Americans, you have Afro-Caribbeans, and you have Africans in the neighborhood. And in fact, like Jewish people who may be Spanish, Sephardic, or Ashkenazic from Eastern Europe, although we're all Jewish, we don't always get along. So I did some work at St. Paul's Lutheran Church, which was up the block from where our synagogue was. And I interviewed the pastor there, and he said, you know what? We have a totally Black congregation, but we have difficulties culturally between these types of things. So my consciousness was raised on that score as well. So I no longer refer to people who are Black as Black. They're Africans, African Americans, or Afro-Caribbeans with very, very different cultures. Now, I just jumped over a whole bunch of themes. I'm anxious to see what other questions you have for me as we go along.
Thank you. Thank you for that insight. Thank you. I want to jump to chapter 4. It's about the police, the Parkchester police. Don't pick on the flowers, right? And on page 95, you mentioned that gangs did not make their ugly mark because of the social pathologies that gave rise to these groups, did not trouble the enclave, which is Parkchester. Right. So why do you think the Parkchester police were so strict? Like, what were they really? What was their problem? Like, you know, they weren't dealing. There weren't any Blacks because you mentioned 1940. You know, out of 51,000 whites that were living in the area, there were like 39 Blacks, right? So, you know, what was it that the Parkchester police feared so much? Not only,
by the way, they were unarmed police, okay? But
yes.
A couple of things. First of all,
everyone was unarmed.
after World War II in New York City, it's an era of a lot of gang warfare. In fact, you probably know that the origins of West Side Story, the play and then the movie, had to do with this conflict between, in this case, a Latino and I think an Italian-American boy. By the way, initially, the play and the movie was supposed to be called East Side Story, but an Italian boy and a Jewish girl, but those issues had gone by the wayside. So there's a lot of gang activity in the neighborhood. And one of the things, you know, when you do this work, sometimes you think you're the only fellow on the block, okay? So I discovered a fellow who's done work on gangs in the Bronx and Manhattan in the 1950s. And he sent me a map, which is in the book, which shows where the gangs are, but they're not in Parkchester. They're not in Parkchester for two reasons. One, you identify the Parkchester police who kept the kids on the straight and narrow. And by the way, if you were arrested by the Parkchester police as a kid and they took your name, right? And it was recorded by the ownership of Parkchester. And years later, you wanted to have an apartment in Parkchester. It was very difficult because you had a rap sheet, so to speak. Okay, so the Parkchester, you couldn't ride your bike on the sidewalk. You couldn't have any animals in your home. Parkchester police were hired by Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation to monitor the neighborhood. Now, that's the negative part about the Parkchester police. The positive part is that they patrol the neighborhood, and therefore you have almost no gangs in Parkchester. And there's something else that should be mentioned, probably more important than the Parkchester cops. And that is the fact that the ethnic groups living in that area, and I'm talking about pre-1968, pre-integration, We're talking again about Jews and Italians and Irish and Germans and white Protestants. All these people are doing pretty well in an economy after World War II, which is in the upswing in this city and in this country. So one of the origins of gang warfare are kids who come from families who feel, excuse me, that they're being undermined and they're losing out. There is a spirit of cooperation in the neighborhood, which you don't see in other neighborhoods. And there's one other thing. I mean, there's so many other things. If you wanted to get into Parkchester, you were interviewed by a social worker who came to your home to check out whether you were an appropriate family for the neighborhood. And I use a term which is a Jewish term. People got into Parkchester. They felt they were chosen people to live in this new neighborhood. On the other hand, you have a situation where people do not qualify. You know what? One of my interviews was with a Monsignor Graham, who today is a priest in the Bronx area. I have to say, by the way, that I got tremendous cooperation from another number of Catholic priests who worked in Parkchester. One of them is Thomas Derivan, who is and continues to be a very good friend. Anyway, so Monsignor Graham said that when the Parkchester social workers came to their home and they looked at their home and they didn't get into Parkchester. So when he became a priest and became involved with St. Raymond's Church, which is one of the two great churches in the neighborhood, when he gave a lecture, and it's pretty funny, says, he used to say that I didn't get into Parkchester as a kid, but now as a Monsignor, I finally made it to Parkchester. So there's a certain optimism among people in that neighborhood, very different from other places in the city. Look, if you live as a Jew on the Grand Concourse, you would live in what you'd call a Jewish building. The vast majority of people were Jewish, okay? In Parkchester, it's random housing. This is social engineering by Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation. So you find out that people of different backgrounds are living together. Now, I want to be clear about one other thing, many other things. I'm not saying that the Jews and the Christians became great friends. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is there was a get-along spirit that didn't exist previously in New York among these ethnic groups, as they all lived together in this bucolic neighborhood in the heart of the Bronx. And the Parkchester police were only part of that dynamic in terms of ensuring that everybody behaved. So one autobiographical story. Very often on a Sunday morning, I would climb over the fence in the West Quadrant to play basketball. And I was sometimes stopped by Parkchester police, and they took my name. I said, fine, my name is Peter Stein, my friend. But that's okay, because when Peter Stein got arrested, he used my name. So that was part of the culture of that time with the Parkchester police at that time period. Anyway, so that's part of our story.
Thanks for that funny vignette. You know, it relates because we all had our own childhoods and we all have done our deeds. So, getting caught and, taking a fall for your friend, that's just an old story. In chapter 5, you speak about Stuyvesant Town, which was built almost a decade after.
A few years after.
A few years, right.
Also built by Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation.
Yes. Along with Peter Cooper Village.
Right.
And you list that in 1947, even before the living community was even open, Stuyvesant Town was already getting sued by Black veterans. Right. And this went to the Supreme Court. They sided with the Metropolitan Insurance Company, and it was appealed, and they still cited, right?
Right.
So I'm not far into the book. Why did it take the Metropolitan Insurance Company so long to sell Stuyvesant Town, which was back in 2008, rather than, in 1968 when they sold off Parkchester to the Helmsley Corporation?
Right. Okay. So first of all, we have to understand, and I noted this a few moments ago, that until 1954, before Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, segregation was the law of the land, okay? So that's the way things were at that point. You can say the beginnings of the civil rights movement dates from 1947, one of my interests, when Jackie Robinson's allowed to play Major League Baseball, okay? This is a very segregated country, both down south and also up north, okay? Now, the rationale of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation is, from a fiduciary point of view, they're concerned about the values of their property, and they feel that if minorities get into Parkchester, it's going to upset. So I have a great story in the book that I want to share with you. Okay, in the early 1950s, a group of Jewish communists in Parkchester decide they're going to integrate Parkchester. And one of the 31 rules that you had to sign in when you got an apartment in Parkchester was that you would not sublet the apartment. So taking cues from Stuyvesant Town, okay, they invite, as you indicated, a African American veteran and his family, the Decatur's, to take over the apartment. So the Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation object, and they take the offending communists and their Black friends to court. And the court sides with Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation. But here's the most interesting thing, I believe. Oh, I'm sorry, one other piece. The day where these Blacks are going to be evicted from Parkchester, a group of whites and Blacks go down to Madison Avenue, to the home of Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation, and they chain themselves to the desk of the person in charge of Parkchester. They get arrested. Now, how do I know all this? This is the most important point. After this happens, the legal counsel for Parkchester writes a law article talking about his efforts to maintain the financial stability of the neighborhood, and it's published in a law journal. Now, I want to tell you, the law journal is not the University of Mississippi or the University of Alabama. It is the law journal of the American Bar Association. He's not ashamed of what he's doing. He's doing what was appropriate in terms of the minds of America back in the 1950s. Oh, and he's got a great footnote. He says, for more on this story, check the Daily Worker. Now, the Daily Worker, excuse me as I take a sip of tea. And again, I apologize for the quality of my voice. The Daily Worker was a communist newspaper. So I was able to read the communist newspaper to get their side of the story, okay? So that will ensure that Parkchester in the 50s will remain segregated. Now, in the 60s, when civil rights laws begin to develop in our city, Stuyvesant Town is integrated before Parkchester because Stuyvesant Town, they took money from the state of New York to help build those buildings. Parkchester was a completely private development. And by the way, Angel, Never tell a Parkchester person or alumnus that they live in
the projects. I know.
We live in a development, and it says a great deal about the difference. Okay?
I've been hearing about this since I was a kid. We don't live in the projects. This is not the projects.
You want to know something? You want to know something? My Parkchester alumni who are listening to this, the minority groups literally lived on the other side of the tracks. Those tracks were the subway tracks, right? Which brought us, and you can imagine, and I can visualize this from my own life. Every day, thousands of men and some women march together down to the subway for 5 cents and then the 15 cents to go into what we called the city, Manhattan. And the Jews and the Gentiles, all whites, they worked in comparable occupations. Can I say a few words about my parents, if you don't mind? Okay. My father was a New York City fireman. That was the #1 occupation of men in Parkchester. In fact, you know, we talk about those wonderful Art Deco gargoyles there. One of the gargoyles is of a fireman or of a policeman. So they're working together. And again, don't get the impression, I want to be very careful about this, that all of a sudden people became great friends. But there's a difference between being great friends and being enemies. And that doesn't obtain to a great extent within the Parkchester neighborhood. Very, very important as far as that's concerned. One other thing about Jews and Catholics getting along, which I often mention to my students about, one of the great popes, maybe the greatest pope of the 20th century, was Angelo Roncalli, better known as Pope John the 23rd. So Pope John the 23rd convenes Vatican II. And the significance of Vatican II is that at that point, the Catholic Church absolves the Jews from the deicide charge, which hung over us for 2,000 years. Now, you have in Parkchester a number of outstanding priests who are teaching a different vision of what it means to be a Jew or a Catholic. In fact, I found some, since I love sports and I've written about sports, I found out that some outstanding Jewish basketball players played for St. Helena's basketball team. Pretty interesting in terms of integration. So this is a very different type of community and very much in line with things. Oh, so in the 60s, Stuyvesant Town opens up. It's not until 1968 that Parkchester is opened up. And the Human Rights Commission, and one of the people who works for the Human Rights Commission, just give me one more second here. A young man named Freddie Farrar, who becomes later on Bronx Borough president, who lived for a while in Parkchester. The Human Rights Commission tells the Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation, you know what? If you don't open up Parkchester, not only are we going to fine you as we've been doing up until now, which for them was the cost of doing business, we're going to throw you all in jail. At that point, things change dramatically. And as far as the integration of Parkchester is concerned, I wish to make 2 points about this. Number one, the battle over integration within Parkchester did not take place on the streets of Parkchester. Again, I want to back off and say, and I write about this, it isn't as if all the Jews and all the Catholics were thrilled that Blacks were moving into the neighborhoods. And there's some instances of nastiness, that's for sure. But there's no concerted attempt to keep, on the part of the residents of Parkchester, to keep the neighborhood segregated. And one of the joys, one last thing, then I'll take your next question. One of the joys of doing this book was the fact that I've met a number of the early African Americans who moved into the neighborhood, who thank God are still around. And some of them were involved either pro bono or for salaries for the NAACP or for the Urban League. And when Parkchester opened up, they said to themselves, hey, wait a minute, we're going to do exactly what the white folks do. We're going to jump to the front of the line and we're going to get in first. And they've been there ever since. And I became friendly with a number of them. And one of the couples, I'm having a senior moment, I'm forgetting the name, but it's still important, says to me, Jeff, why are you studying me? And I said, you know what? Because you remind me of my parents. Solid, working class, lower middle class people who move into a new neighborhood from, yes, Angel, from projects and other parts of the city. So I talk about in one of the chapters, it's a mixed reception on the part of the white folk there, but you don't have riots on the streets. You know what? Another thing I want to say that's in the book. In the late 1970s, there's a blackout in the city of New York. People my age and older remember that, right? And a lot of neighborhoods were literally destroyed during those days. Interestingly, in Parkchester, there's no destruction. And neighbors help neighbors during the blackout, a very different situation. So I've been accused, and it's okay, I've been accused of putting a very positive spin on Parkchester's history. It's not perfect, but it's something very special. And that's what intrigued me in doing the book.
Trust me, I don't think you're sugarcoating. Your book actually spells everything out, and it can it just puts everything into perspective. So, and just one little fun tidbit: Frank Lowe, you've mentioned in the first chapter, started off at the mailroom of the Metropolitan Insurance Company. I actually worked in the mailroom too for a couple of years, so that kind of gave me chills because we come from different walks of life, and we have different views.
You should know, by the way, that with all the segregation, if you go to Metropolitan Oval, the beautiful Metropolitan Oval is still beautiful, right?
Yes, it is.
A plaque in memory of Eckert, who was the person behind the establishment of the community. You know what? At the end of the book, I reveal that I grew up in the neighborhood. And I want to tell a story about a young man that I met, and his picture is in the book, who's a Bangladeshi Muslim, who is part of the mosque, which was my synagogue. So I want to understand who these people are and what their lives were like. So I go to the mosque one day, and I try to interview the imam. Very nice gentleman, but his English is not all that good. A young man steps up and he says, "Can I help you, sir?" I said, "Sure." And he basically translates for me our interview. And then he says to me, "You know what? Would you like to see the other 5 mosques?" I say, "Sure." I come back the following week and we drive around Parkchester. And you know what, by the way, when I say drive around Parkchester, one of the things Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation did or didn't do was not to permit the building of houses of worship within the heartland of Parkchester. St. Raymond's on St. Raymond's Avenue, St. Helena's is on Benedict Avenue, Temple Emmanuel was down the block from St. Helena's, the outskirts of the neighborhood. So we're driving around. And as we're driving around, I say to him, his name is Tasbadal Islam, that's his name. I said to him, when I was a kid, I lived around the corner from the synagogue, which is now a mosque. And on a cold winter morning, a snow morning, the rabbi would call me and my brother and my dad to come down to make the minyan. A minyan, for those who aren't Jewish, is you need a quorum of 10 men to have services. And after the services, my father would go off to work, and I would get a reward from Rabbi Schwartz. You know what he gave me, Angel? He gave me a shovel to shovel off the sidewalk. So the kid says to me, "That's awfully interesting. I use the same shovel." Now listen, it's not literally the same shovel, but it could be the same shovel. And he had a weekend job. He ran a youth group in the mosque. I ran a youth group in the synagogue. So again, I'm not saying that Jews and Muslims get along famously. Obviously, there's a lot of tension. But these Bangladeshis who are part of the Parkchester scene today remind me that good people of all backgrounds can have similar types of experiences. And I reserve that for the end of the book. And rather than have a picture of myself as an author, I have a picture of myself with this young man. Maybe can you see this? Can you see this? We're standing outside the mosque, which was my synagogue. So those are some of the things that I try to do in doing this book. Other questions, or maybe we should open it up for questions or comments from our wonderful
audience. We're running up on time, so I'll just open it up to the floor, but I'd like to start with a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
First of all, someone brought up earlier that when Parkchester was being built, it was also the era of redlining, and which is absolutely true. It was happening all over the city, right. So, I like to call Parkchester the microcosm, of what was going on throughout. So,
listen, redlining is, I see these questions, okay? Redlining was designed, it is also part of the saga of segregation. Redlining has to do with giving minority groups loans to own their own houses, to own their own apartments, as opposed to renting apartments. One of the greatest pieces of legislation in 20th century American history is 1944, the GI Bill, which leads to the suburbanization of this country. So Levittown, which is founded by a Jew in Pennsylvania and in Nassau County, was open to Jews and other whites, but it was segregated. So this is another piece of the segregation story. Mr. Richter, Michael Richter asked, were there income limits for applicants for apartments? The answer is yes. And that is, they didn't, interestingly enough, they didn't want very affluent people in the neighborhood. In fact, there was a bit of prejudice, believe it or not, against physicians living in Parkchester. So they want, excuse me, lower middle class and working class people. Yes, there were income. They don't want people who are too affluent. What portion of apartments today, Michael Richter asked, are condos versus rentals? Well, that's another part of the story, and that is, beginning in the 1980s, Parkchester moves from being a rental to being condos, and that's I write about how this transforms the neighborhood. Sadly, I have in my notes, I don't know if people saw this. There was an article in the Times real estate section on Sunday. It's called "What is Wrong with This Picture?" And there's a picture of Parkchester, and it says that the neighborhood is in decline. The infrastructure is falling down, and people, in other words, there was resurgence of optimism in Parkchester. I'm not telling the story completely. In the 1970s, Parkchester was taken over by the Helmsley Corporation. And frankly, they didn't do a good job. Later on, through a variety of initiatives, Parkchester was sold to another operation, and the rehabilitation of Parkchester takes place. You know, anytime you write contemporary history, Angel, the day you finish the damn book, it's already outdated, right? It's already outdated. It's 3 years. Sadly, some of the complaints that people had against the Helmsleys, that the buildings are falling down, at water damage, garbage collection, issues with heat, elevators that don't often work, and so on, is a replay what happened in the 1980s. Now, Susan Tunick asked, do you think Parkchester remain intact, or do you see the destruction of the terracotta sculptures and plaques as just a necessary evil? I think it's evil. I think the architecture of Parkchester is something that the architecture of Parkchester was very, very important. June Golden asked, do you think the separation of public schools and parochial schools affected the sense of community? Yes, most Jewish kids went to PS 102 or PS 106, I think it was, or middle school or junior high school 127, and most of the Catholic kids went to the parochial schools. But we met in the play areas of Parkchester. Of course, my family is somewhat different because I was sent to a Jewish school and I took the subway down to Manhattan every day. But yes, that was a part of the story. One other thing about a sense of community, if you lived in Parkchester during the summer, you know that the apartments were hot as blazes, hot as hell. And there was no air conditioning in Parkchester until about 15 years ago. So to deal with the heat in Parkchester, people opened their windows and they opened their doors and for cross ventilation. One of the things I had to study in doing this work was the history of air conditioning in the city of New York. It's a very important issue, how you live your life. Now, my father, who grew up in a tenement in Harlem, you know, he could live with the heat. My generation did not like that sort of thing. And someone told me, I think this is pretty funny, that the major movie theater, there were three movie theaters in Parkchester: the Circle, the Palace, and the American, the Lowe's American. So one year, they showed the 10 Commandments, which was a 5-hour movie. So a guy told me that he sat through the 10 Commandments twice, 10 hours, because it was air conditioned. So air conditioning has a lot to do with how people live their lives, and that was part of the story of Parkchester. Other questions? Or are we short on time, Angel? Angel,
we still have some time. Yep. Hear me now. We still have some time. Any other questions? I know there's a comment by Susan Phillips. Redlining caused the deterioration of neighborhoods because it kept those that had the smallest percentage of Blacks from getting loans. The departure of whites to Levittown and other suburbs that kept Blacks out further deteriorated neighborhood that were redlined. Redlining was a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes,
absolutely.
I want to say something else about that that's very important. And that is, historians like myself often talk about the phenomenon of white flight out of urban neighborhoods. Well, in the 1970s, as New York City deteriorated during the Beam administration and elsewhere, I write about a Black flight. What do I mean by Black flight? I'm talking about, again, solid working class and middle class African Americans who lived in the South Bronx or lived in these projects, as white folk move out, and my argument is that we as white folk are not pushed out, we're not driven out, we're doing better, and we want to live in air-conditioned apartments, we want to live in private homes, we move out, and there are areas which are open, and African Americans move in, they're fleeing Black neighborhoods, moving into a better, now integrated neighborhood, which happens to be Parkchester. Barbara Flaxman is asked, is there a difference between Parkchester and
I'm sorry, hold before you go to the next question.
Yeah.
I think June Golden had a comment. I'm sorry,
Yes,
June. I saw your hand go up. I saw.
I know. I'm trying to figure out. Am I talking on it now?
June, talk to me.
I'm trying to.
Yes, we can hear you.
I hear
Okay.
you loud and clear.
And by the way, for anybody else who grew up when I did, my maiden name at the time was Tauber, and my parents were both teachers in Parkchester.
Right.
And my father then went on to head Bronx Community College. But one of the things that kept, and we used to protest against the segregation of Parkchester. I don't know whether we were part of the leftist group that got arrested. But
you're too looking at you, you're too young for the 1950s protests, okay? But maybe 1960s protests, but it wasn't so much on the streets of Parkchester. But please continue. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that was wonderful that made a community, and I was the one who asked about the parochial schools because I missed my Catholic friends when I lived across the street from St. Raymond's, and I missed them when they went off to parochial schools. But Parkchester itself, I thought, did something interesting. There were community activities. Yes. There was a ball field. There were community square dances. I mean, it was like living, the best part of living in a small town. And I'm wondering whether they continue doing that. They had shuffleboard tournaments and things like that that drew us, again, all together.
Yeah, you know what, I'm glad you mentioned it. That this was what's known as controlled play. They want kids to play in the playgrounds. There were youth directors, there were playground directors, there were tournaments of all sorts. Absolutely, that was part of the scene, which brought people together. Look, there were bullies in the neighborhood, but the bullies, you know, were bullies without regard to creed or national origin. So that was part of the scene during that time. Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that.
The only other thing I was going to say about the Art Deco, which was quite beautiful, but you showed the one that scared the bejesus out of me, which was a bear on top of a pillar, which I always thought was going to, it was my building. Yeah. Going to leap down on my head every
You think
night.
It would fall over, right?
Right.
June,
well, I'll tell you what, you know, to add on to your beginning.
Where'd you live in Parkchester?
1705 Purdy Street, across the street from St. Raymond's.
Were you a synagogue attending family?
We schlepped over to Temple Emmanuel. Yes, my father ran the youth groups there.
On me? Temple
Emmanuel.
Sorry? Yeah. I saved all the records of Young Israel Parkchester, but those records of Temple Emmanuel, which was much larger than Young Israel Parkchester. And by the way, another autobiographical piece. Angel mentioned I live in the Bronx. I live in Riverdale. About 8 or 9 families who grew up in Parkchester reaffiliated with a synagogue in Riverdale, and we're known as the Parkchester alumni. And we still have a strong sense of our synagogue and what it meant within that neighborhood. But that's part of the story. Can I answer Barbara Flaxman's question, Angel?
June.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to add on to June's comment.
Sure.
There's in Parkchester, there are not many organized events, but the community uses the spaces. Like every year, the Bangladeshi community, they do a Bollywood dance, festival there at the square. So there's nothing that's totally organized, but people that live in Parkchester today, they use up the space like it's always been used, for many years. It's just not organized. There's no directors or anything like that, but it's still used like it was back in the 50s and 60s.
The difference between Parkchester.
Go ahead, Jeffrey, with the next.
Pardon me, I want to answer Barbara's question. By the way, if you haven't read the book and you're interested in the book, it can be purchased from NYU Press. If you look at the picture of the cover, there's my friend Father Derivan on the cover. There's Metropolitan Oval, and I think it's a very fine book. You know, when I wrote the book, sadly, it was designed to come out for the 80th anniversary of Parkchester. Little did we know that it took place during the beginnings of the pandemic. So there's been a renewed interest in Parkchester. And on February 7th, I'm giving a lecture about Parkchester at SUNY Purchase, which is very nice. Now, Barbara Flaxman, Parkchester and Co-op City. Co-op City, first of all, is air conditioned. Second of all, it's built 30 years after Parkchester. And the third thing is it attracts significant numbers of people who want to live in Co-op City from Parkchester in the 1970s. But you know, Co-op City had its own problems, not so much in terms of race, but in terms of how it was built, how it was managed, and the like. So yes, I deal with Co-op City as one of the places where people move to, white people move to when they leave Parkchester.
Good. Any other questions?
Well, I'm just wondering, do you think that, and I haven't read your book and I intend to, that there is that strong sense of community and intermingling now? And is there a way to get other neighborhoods to do that and support that? And also, can the community save, I did read the New York Times article, can they save the structures and the beauty and the artwork, which I didn't think was such when I was a kid, but.
Well, yeah, I didn't think much of the Art Deco as a kid either, but from what the article tells us, it's more than, it's bigger than the Parkchester story. It speaks to the problems of housing in New York City. It's bigger, excuse me, it's bigger than all of us. Angel, my voice is going, so I'm
good. You're done. Good.
Wrap it up here.
Well, listen,
a pleasure being with you all. And you know, if you buy the book, I make 10 cents on every book I sell, or 25 cents, but it's worth reading and you'll see yourselves in that history. So it's been a pleasure, and you know, continue your good work, both with the library and with your association.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gur.
Thank you so much, Professor Gurock, and thank you so much, Angel. And thank you everyone who attended this program. I just wanted to give a brief explanation as to why we're doing this. Parkchester was one of our 6 to Celebrate neighborhoods in 2022. The Historic Districts Council has a program called 6 to Celebrate, where we choose 6 neighborhood groups every year, and we help them achieve their preservation goals. Parkchester was one of our 6 to Celebrate groups in 2022, and we've been working to preserve the terracotta sculptures, to provide a landmark status to Parkchester. That's our ultimate goal. But I want to thank Professor Gurock and Angel for this very informational session. And as I said, we will post this on YouTube.